What would you do if the only thing you had left in the world was a key to a room you were no longer allowed to enter? For Rose Whitcomb, this wasn't a question. It was the sharp, bitter truth of an afternoon in the Wyoming Territory, the year of our Lord, 1883. She had inherited her late uncle's meager possessions, only to be told the land he'd worked for a decade was never his at all, swallowed by the relentless advance of the Union Pacific Railroad. But what the world dismisses often holds the secret the world most needs, and the overgrown trail leading away from town toward a bridge no one had crossed in 80 years held a truth nailed shut and waiting for a steady hand. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from as we tell the story of a forgotten cabin, a broken bridge, and the quiet woman who dared to cross. Rose Whitcomb stood on the plank sidewalk of Covenant Creek, the dust of the street coating the hem of her worn gray dress. In her hand, she held a small, useless brass key. Behind her, the door to her uncle's boarding room was closed for good. Silas Croft, the railroad agent, had been polite in the way a wolf is polite before it bites. He'd shown her the paperwork. His signature, a confident black slash at the bottom of a page full of legal print that smelled of ink and finality. The land, he'd explained with a patient smile that didn't reach his eyes, had been part of a railroad grant for years. Her uncle, Elias, had been a squatter, nothing more. A fact the company had chosen to overlook until his passing. It was a kindness, he suggested, that they weren't billing his estate for back rent. Rose's estate consisted of a single trunk containing 3 patched dresses, a tintype of her parents, and a worn Bible. She had nothing left to give. The town watched her from behind parted curtains and through the swinging doors of the saloon. She felt their pity and their dismissal, 2 sides of the same tarnished coin. She was 25 years old, an orphan twice over, and utterly alone in a town that had already written her off. Her uncle had been a quiet man, a dreamer who wrote letters filled with descriptions of the sky and the way the light fell on the valley, but little about legal claims or railroad disputes. He'd told her this was a place to build a life, a place where hard work was its own deed. He had been wrong. She walked toward the livery stable, the only place she could think to go. The air was thin and cool, carrying the scent of pine from the high country and the smell of hot dust from the flats. Jebediah, the owner, was an old man with hands as gnarled as ancient roots. He'd known her uncle. He looked at her face, then at the small trunk she carried, and seemed to understand everything without a word being spoken. "Heard about Croft," Jebediah said, his voice a low rumble. "That man's got a soul made of ledger paper." Rose simply nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She had enough money for a ticket east, back to a life of factory work and crowded tenements. But the thought was like a shroud. She had come west for air, for space, for the promise of a future carved from the land itself. To turn back now felt like a second death. She asked Jebediah what lay beyond the town's edge, past the last homestead. He paused, rubbing his jaw. "Ain't much," he said slowly. "The railroad owns the valley floor. The high country's too rough. There's the old Thorn place, I suppose." He gestured with his chin toward a distant tree-choked ridge to the north. No one's been out there since before the territory was even a thought. The bridge over Covenant Gorge washed out in the flood of 2003, 80 years ago. Nothing beyond it but ghosts and rattlesnakes. A forgotten place, a place no one wanted. The words resonated in the hollow space inside her, a place the railroad couldn't possibly have catalogued. Is it on railroad land? She asked, her voice quiet. Jebediah shrugged. Doubt it. It's on the wrong side of the gorge. The original survey maps are a mess. Most folks figure if you can't get to it, it don't matter who owns it. He looked at her again, a flicker of something, pity perhaps, or a sliver of respect in his weathered eyes. It's a hard trail, and there's nothing there, just a ruin. A ruin was better than nothing. It was a direction. I'll need a mule, she said, her voice finding a sudden, surprising strength. He led her to a stall where a gray-muzzled mule stood patiently, his long ears twitching. He was old, but his eyes were clear and steady. Name's Moses, Jebediah said. He's stubborn, but he knows his feet. Take him, and this. He pushed a canvas sack into her hands. Inside was a coil of rope, a small hatchet, a sack of flour, and a tin of coffee. It was an act of charity she could not refuse. As she loaded her small trunk onto the mule's back, she heard the whispers of the townspeople, a foolish girl chasing a ghost story, heading for a ruin no one had seen in a lifetime. She was walking willingly into a place the world had forgotten, a place defined only by its inaccessibility and its worthlessness. The bridge was broken. The cabin was a ruin. The land was forgotten. Was this a desperate last stand, or the biggest mistake of her life? What secrets are kept in places no one dares to go? Let us know what you think in the comments, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of forgotten history. For Rose Whitcomb, the journey was just beginning. The trail to the old Thorn place was less a path and more a memory. It wound away from the main road, a faint depression in the earth quickly swallowed by sagebrush and juniper. Rose led Moses by the rope, the mule's hooves placing themselves with a deliberate, steady rhythm that she found herself matching. The sun was hot on her shoulders, and the silence was vast, broken only by the buzz of insects and the cry of a distant hawk. Within an hour, the last rooftops of Covenant Creek had disappeared behind her. She was alone. She walked for hours, the ridgeline her only guide. Late in the afternoon, she heard it, the rush of water. She pushed through a final thicket of willows and stopped. Before her was Covenant Gorge, a deep, rocky chasm carved into the earth, and spanning it, or what was left of it, was the bridge. It was a skeleton. Two massive stone abutments, monuments of forgotten labor, still stood firm on either side. But of the bridge itself, only two thick, dark beams of timber remained, stretching halfway across the gap before ending in splintered, jagged points. The rest was gone, claimed by the flood 80 years prior. The water churned 30 feet below, a torrent of white and gray over slick, dark rocks. It was impassable. She stood at the edge, the wind pulling at her hair, and felt a wave of despair so profound it almost buckled her knees. Jebediah was right. There was nothing here, just an ending. As she stood there, a horse approached from the trail behind her. It was Silas Croft, the railroad agent, his city suit looking absurdly out of place against the wild landscape. He sat atop his fine bay mare with an air of smug satisfaction. "Chasing ghosts, Miss Whitcomb?" he called out, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the water. He didn't wait for an answer. "I admire your spirit. I truly do. But this is where it ends. This land, the land beyond. It's all charted on our new maps. Useless, but charted. There's no claim to be had here. Go back to town. The stage leaves for Cheyenne on Friday." He smiled that same empty smile. "There's a place for a woman like you back east." He made it sound like an insult. Rose said nothing. She stared at all he couldn't reach. His smile tightened. He tipped his hat in a mocking gesture and turned his horse around, riding away without a backward glance. He was so certain. Everyone was. Just as the sound of his horse faded, she noticed a figure downstream, half hidden by the riverside brush. An old woman, her back bent, was gathering something in a basket. Her hair was long and silver, braided down her back. As if feeling Rose's gaze, she straightened up and looked directly at her. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes dark and knowing. She took a few slow steps closer, her gaze fixed on the broken timbers of the bridge, then on the nailed-shut cabin barely visible through the trees on the other side. The old woman spoke, her voice thin but clear, like the whisper of dry leaves. "Some things are closed to keep the wrong people out," she said, her eyes meeting Rose's. "Some are closed to keep the right person in." And with that, she turned and disappeared back into the willows, leaving Rose alone with the roaring water, the mocking laughter of the railroad man still hanging in the air, and a cryptic warning that felt more like a key than a lock. Rose did not try to cross the gorge that day. The sun was dipping low, painting the canyon walls in hues of orange and deep purple. The old woman's words echoed in her mind, a strange counterpoint to Croft's dismissive certainty. She made a small, cold camp near the stone abutment, tethering Moses where he could graze on the sparse grass. She ate a piece of hardtack from Jebediah's sack and drank cold water from the creek upstream of the gorge. Sleep did not come easily. The rushing water was a constant roar, a reminder of the barrier before her. She lay wrapped in her thin blanket, staring up at a sky littered with more stars than she had ever seen, and felt the full weight of her isolation. This was it, the end of the line. Yet with the dawn came not despair, but a quiet, stubborn resolve. If she could not go over, she would go through. She left Moses tethered and began to walk the rim of the gorge, searching for another way. The rock walls were steep, almost sheer in places, but she was patient. Her uncle had taught her to read the land, to see its folds and creases not as obstacles, but as invitations. Hours passed. The sun climbed high. Her boots were scuffed, her hands scraped from gripping rock and roots. Finally, nearly a mile downstream, she found what she was looking for. The gorge widened and sloped, the walls giving way to a steep, boulder-strewn incline that led down to the water. It was treacherous, but it was possible. She went back for Moses. The mule, true to his nature, picked his way down the hazardous slope with an unnerving calm, his hooves finding purchase where Rose could see none. At the bottom, the water was still fast but shallower, rushing over a bed of smooth, flat stones. It was a ford, perhaps the same one the original builders of the bridge had used. They crossed, the icy water soaking her dress to the knee, and began the arduous climb up the other side. It was late afternoon by the time she stood on the opposite bank, looking back at the broken bridge from this new perspective. She was on the other side. She had crossed. A faint trail, even more overgrown than the one on the other side, led away from the gorge and into a stand of ancient, towering pines. She followed it. The air grew still and cool under the canopy of trees. The light was dim, filtered through the dense needles. And then she saw it. The cabin stood in a small clearing, bathed in the slanted golden light of the setting sun. It was small, made of massive hand-hewn logs, the spaces between them chinked with mud and moss that had long since dried and crumbled. The roof sagged in the middle, and the single window was boarded over. The door was made of thick, solid planks, and it was held shut not by a lock, but by a heavy wooden beam nailed horizontally across it with thick, rusted spikes. It looked less like a home and more like a tomb. A wave of disappointment washed over her. It was a ruin, just as they'd said. She ran a hand over the rough logs. The wood was silvered with age but felt incredibly solid beneath her fingers. She spent her first night on the far side of the gorge, huddled in her blanket, on the cabin's small, dilapidated porch, with Moses cropping the grass nearby. She listened to the whisper of the wind in the pines and the strange groans and creaks of the old structure as it settled in the cool night air. It was a lonely sound, the sound of a place long abandoned, but for the first time in weeks, it wasn't the sound of a locked door in a boarding house. It was the sound of something that might, just might, be hers. The next morning, Rose began her work. Her first task was to get inside the cabin. She had no tools to pull the heavy spikes holding the beam across the door. She searched the clearing, her eyes scanning for anything she could use. She found a flat, heavy stone near the edge of the woods, its edge sharp enough to serve as a wedge. For the next hour, she worked tirelessly, using a smaller rock as a hammer to drive the stone wedge between the beam and the doorframe. The spikes shrieked in protest, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet forest. Her arms ached and sweat beaded on her forehead, but she did not stop. Finally, with a groan of surrendering wood, the beam tore free. The door itself was not locked. The heavy iron latch lifted easily, and with a creak of rusted hinges, the door swung inward, opening into darkness. A gust of stale, musty air rushed out to meet her. The smell of dust, dry rot, and something else. The clean, sharp scent of aged pine. She stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the gloom. Light filtered in through the cracks in the walls and the crumbling chinking. The interior was a single room, larger than she had expected. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and black. A simple wooden table and a single chair stood in the center of the room, both covered in a thick blanket of dust. A bed frame with a rotted rope mattress was pushed against the far wall. It was stark, empty, and forgotten. She set to work cleaning. She used the hem of her apron to wipe the dust from the table, then found a tattered broom in the corner and began to sweep the floor. Decades of dirt and leaves swirled in the shafts of light. As she swept near the hearth, the broom snagged on something. She knelt to look closer. There, etched into the wide plank of the floorboard, were a series of fine, precise lines. They were not scratches or marks of wear. They formed a perfect right angle, with smaller hash marks branching off at measured intervals. A faint circle was carved at the intersection. It was deliberate. It looked like something from a draftsman's table, a surveyor's mark. But it made no sense here. Inside a cabin, etched into the floor. She ran her fingers over the lines. They were smooth with age, but undeniably man-made. It was the first thing in this place that felt less like decay and more like design. She didn't understand it, but she filed it away in her mind. It was a detail that didn't fit the story of a simple, abandoned shack. She continued her work. Her curiosity piqued. As she cleared cobwebs from the ceiling beams, she noticed the joinery. The massive logs were fitted together with intricate dovetail notches, a feat of craftsmanship that would have taken immense skill and time. This was no hastily built shelter. This place had been built to last. It had been built with a purpose. That night, she slept inside, on the floor near the hearth, the strange markings just inches from her head. The cabin was no longer just a ruin. It was a puzzle, and she had just found the first piece. Rose knew she couldn't survive here for long without a proper way to bring in supplies. The treacherous ford was a one-time solution, not a lifeline. She needed to repair the bridge. The thought was daunting, but the alternative, giving up, was unthinkable. The cabin, with its silent mysteries, had already taken root in her. It felt more like home than any place she had ever known. She needed help, and she needed someone who understood timber and angles. Jebediah had mentioned a man, a surveyor named Thomas Hale, who sometimes took on odd jobs. He was a widower, a quiet man who kept to himself on a small plot of land west of town. The next morning, she made the difficult journey back across the gorge and walked into Covenant Creek. She found Thomas Hale splitting wood behind a small, tidy cabin. He was tall and lean, with a stillness about him that seemed at odds with the powerful swing of his axe. His face was weathered, and his eyes, when he finally looked up at her, were a clear, startling blue, clouded with a reserved sorrow. Rose stated her business plainly. She needed help repairing the bridge to the old Thorn place. She had little money, but she was a hard worker and would pay him what she could when she could. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. "That's a fool's errand," he said when she finished, his voice low and even. "That bridge is gone, and there's nothing out there worth the trouble." "There's a cabin," she replied, her chin held high. "And it's solid. The man who built it was a master carpenter." Thomas Hale stopped his work, leaning the axe against the chopping block. He seemed about to dismiss her, but then she added, "There are markings on the floor, by the hearth, surveyor's marks, a baseline, I think." His posture changed. A flicker of professional curiosity lit his eyes. "Inside the house?" he asked, his skepticism warring with his interest. "That makes no sense." "I know," Rose said. "That's why I thought of you." He was silent for a long moment, studying her as if she were a complex map. He saw not a foolish girl, but someone with a quiet, unyielding determination that mirrored something in himself. "I'll look at it," he said finally. "But we'll need a good deal more than rope and hope to fix that span." The work began the next day. Thomas was a man of few words, but his actions were clear and precise. He showed Rose how to select the right trees, tall, straight pines that could serve as new stringers for the bridge. He taught her how to use a two-man saw, and together they felled two massive trees, the crash echoing through the silent forest. They spent days stripping the bark, squaring the logs with adzes, their movements falling into a steady, companionable rhythm. They rarely spoke, but a silent understanding grew between them, forged in the shared language of labor. Rose worked as hard as he did, her hands becoming calloused, her muscles aching with a satisfying weariness at the end of each day. Moses, the mule, became their indispensable partner, hauling ropes and tools, his steady presence a comfort. As they worked, shaping the raw timber into something that could span the gorge, Rose felt she was doing more than just building a bridge. She was building a connection, not just to the forgotten land across the water, but to this quiet, guarded man who had agreed to help her. With the new timber beams shaped and ready, the most dangerous part of the work began. Using a complex system of ropes and Moses's steady strength, Thomas and Rose painstakingly maneuvered the first massive log out over the gorge. It was slow, heart-stopping work. The beam swayed precariously over the churning water below, held only by their combined effort and Thomas's expert knots. Finally, with a heavy thud, it settled into place, resting on the stone abutments, spanning the chasm. The second beam followed. By the end of the week, the main structure of the bridge was restored. It was rough, just two beams side by side, but it was solid. Thomas was the first to walk across, his long strides confident. Rose followed, her hand trailing along the rough-hewn wood, a thrill of accomplishment running through her. They stood together on the other side, looking back at their work. "Now," Thomas said, a hint of a smile touching his lips for the first time. "Let's see these markings of yours." Inside the cabin, Thomas knelt by the hearth, his skilled fingers tracing the lines Rose had found. He pulled a small brass compass from his pocket, then a folding ruler. He measured the angles, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You're right," he murmured, almost to himself. "This is a baseline, an official starting point for a survey. But why would anyone put it inside a building? Unless—" He trailed off, his gaze sweeping the room. His surveyor's eye saw things Rose had missed. The precise north-south alignment of the cabin itself. The way the single window was placed to catch the light of the winter solstice. "This cabin wasn't just a home," he said, standing up. "It was an instrument, a survey station." His eyes fell upon the hearth. He knelt again, running his hand over the flat stones. "The foundation stone of a survey is called a monument," he said. "It has to be permanent, undisturbed." He tapped one of the hearthstones. It gave off a slightly different, more hollow sound. He examined the mortar around its edge. It was a fractionally different shade, a more recent mix. Using the tip of his knife, he carefully began to scrape it away. Together they worked a pry bar into the crack and lifted. The heavy stone came free with a grating sound, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity beneath. Nestled inside the hollow was a small tin box and a packet wrapped in oilcloth, both sealed with wax. Rose's heart pounded in her chest. With trembling hands, she lifted them out. The air in the cabin felt thick with anticipation. They sat at the dusty table and, using Thomas's knife, carefully broke the wax seals. Rose opened the oilcloth packet first. Inside was a thick leather-bound ledger and a folded hand-drawn map, its paper yellowed with age but the ink still sharp and black. Thomas unrolled the map. It was a meticulous survey of the entire valley, including the gorge and the land around the cabin. But the property lines it showed were entirely different from the ones on the railroad's maps. A single large parcel was marked out, with the cabin at its center. In the corner, in elegant script, was the name Elias Thorne, U.S. Territorial Surveyor, and a date, 1865. Nearly a decade before the railroad had even laid its first track in the territory. Rose opened the ledger. The first page was a legal filing for the claim, stamped and sealed by the territorial office in Cheyenne, officially granting the land to Elias Thorne. Her uncle's name had been a coincidence, a common name that had led her here by a strange twist of fate. The last item was a letter, tucked inside the tin box. Rose unfolded it and read the words aloud, her voice wavering. It was a letter from Thorne to his unborn child, explaining that a corrupt land agent was trying to steal his claim for the coming railroad. He had hidden the true survey and his deed here, in the one place no one could disturb it, sealed within the foundation of his work. He wrote of his hope that one day, someone with his blood or his spirit would find it and restore the truth. The cabin wasn't a ruin, it was a vault, and they had just found the key. The news that the bridge was repaired spread through Covenant Creek like a grass fire. People who had dismissed Rose as a fool now spoke of her with a grudging curiosity. Silas Croft was not among them. He rode out to the gorge one afternoon, and saw the solid new timbers spanning the gap. His face, visible even from the cabin, was a mask of cold fury. He could not legally stop Rose from occupying the land while the claim was investigated, but his presence was a constant, silent threat. He was waiting for her to fail. The test came not from Croft, but from the sky. One afternoon in late autumn, the weather turned. The temperature plummeted, and a wind that felt like it was made of ice howled down from the mountains. Within hours, a thick, blinding snow began to fall. It was the first blizzard of the season, and it was a brutal one, catching everyone by surprise. Rose and Thomas were in the cabin, having just finished chinking the last of the walls with fresh mud and moss, when the storm hit its full fury. They had brought in enough firewood to last for days and had a small store of supplies. They were safe, but not everyone was. Late that night, above the shriek of the wind, they heard a desperate cry for help. Thomas opened the door a crack, the wind tearing it from his grasp. Through the swirling snow, they could see a lantern waving frantically near the far side of the bridge. A family in a covered wagon, caught on the road, had seen the faint light from Rose's window and made for it as their last hope. Their horses were exhausted, and the wagon was already half buried in a growing drift. Without a word, Thomas pulled on his heavy coat and grabbed a coil of rope. Rose lit a second lantern. Together, they went out into the storm. The wind on the bridge was a physical force, trying to tear them from their feet. They fought their way across, the snow so thick they could barely see the wagon. Inside were a man, his pregnant wife, and their small, shivering son. They were farmers, new to the territory, and had misjudged the weather. "We saw your light," the man stammered, his face numb with cold. "We thought we were done for." Getting the family across the bridge was a struggle, but guiding the horses and the heavy wagon was nearly impossible. With Thomas leading the terrified animals and Rose and the farmer pushing from behind, they managed to get the wagon across the bridge and into the relative shelter of the clearing. Rose led the mother and child into the warm cabin, wrapping them in blankets and giving them hot coffee from the pot she always kept on the hearth. The cabin was small, but that night it was a sanctuary. Rose gave the family her own small store of food, using the supplies her predecessor, Elias Thorne, had left behind in a sealed cellar she'd discovered. She was no longer just a survivor, fighting for her own small piece of the world. She was a provider, a steward of this place. She had taken what was abandoned and made it a shelter, not just for herself, but for others. From a ridge across the valley, a single light in another cabin blinked out. Silas Croft had been watching, waiting for the storm to break her. Instead, he had just witnessed her true beginning. When the blizzard finally broke 3 days later, the world was buried in a pristine, silent blanket of white. The farmer, whose name was Daniel, and his family were weak but safe. Their gratitude toward Rose and Thomas was immense and heartfelt. "You saved us," his wife Mary said, her hand on her swollen belly. "This place, it's a blessing." As soon as the road was passable, Daniel went into Covenant Creek for supplies. He did not go quietly. He told his story at the general store, at the livery, and in the saloon. He spoke of the howling storm and his family's despair. He described the light in the window of the forgotten cabin, the repaired bridge that had served as a lifeline, and the quiet, determined woman who had taken them in without a moment's hesitation. The story transformed Rose Whitcomb in the eyes of the town. She was no longer the foolish girl chasing ghosts. She was the woman at Thorne's Crossing, a figure of strength and resilience. The townspeople's whispers turned from mockery to respect. While the story spread, Thomas Hale made the 2-day ride to Cheyenne with Elias Thorne's ledger and map carefully protected in an oilcloth satchel. At the Territorial Land Office, he met with a senior clerk, a meticulous man with spectacles and a passion for historical accuracy. The clerk, Mr. Abernathy, listened to the story with growing excitement. He spent an entire day comparing Thorne's map with the official territorial surveys and the railroad's subsequent filings. The next morning, he delivered his verdict. "It's all here," Abernathy said, his voice filled with a quiet reverence as he tapped the ledger. "Thorne's survey is the original. It predates the railroad grant by 8 years. His claim is ironclad. The railroad's survey of this parcel is an error." He used the polite term, but his eyes told Thomas he knew it was fraud. According to this, the land was legally passed to his next of kin, an Elias Whitcomb. He looked at Thomas. "The woman, Rose Whitcomb, is his great-niece. The land is hers. It has always been hers." The news reached Covenant Creek before Thomas did. The telegraph wire hummed with the official correction. Silas Croft received a terse message from his superiors in Omaha. He was to be reassigned to a desk job in a dusty corner of Nebraska. He packed his bags and left on the evening train, his departure as quiet and unceremonious as his arrival had been loud and confident. He was not publicly humiliated, simply erased. The town, which had once turned its back on Rose, now seemed to embrace her. Jebediah rode out with a sack of premium oats for Moses. The blacksmith offered to forge her a proper set of hinges for her door. People began to cross the bridge, not as trespassers, but as curious neighbors, marveling at the solid cabin and the quiet woman who now stood on its porch, watching the valley with a serene and steady gaze. The seasons turned, the deep snows of winter melted, feeding the creek that rushed through the gorge. The valley turned a vibrant green. Rose's cabin was no longer just a shelter, but a home. She had planted a small garden, its neat rows a testament to her patience and hard work. The window, once boarded shut, now held a pane of glass that caught the morning sun. Thomas Hale became a regular visitor, his initial professional curiosity having deepened into a quiet, steady affection that Rose returned in kind. They spent many evenings on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, speaking little but understanding much. The flow of people across the bridge slowed from a curious trickle to a respectful distance. Thorne's Crossing, as the place came to be known, was a landmark now, a piece of the town's living history. The story of its rediscovery had become a local legend. One evening, during the golden hour when the light was soft and warm, Thomas stood with Rose on the porch. He had helped her build a new railing, and the scent of freshly cut pine hung in the air. He looked out at the valley, then at the solid little cabin, and finally at her. "You've done more than just save a piece of land, Rose," he said, his voice soft. "You've built something real here. What will you call it?" Rose was silent for a moment, her gaze following his out over the land that was now truly hers. She thought of the journey that had brought her here. The eviction, the lonely trail, the broken bridge, the cryptic warning, the discovery in the dark. She thought of the surveyor's marks, etched into the floorboard beside the hearth, the starting point for everything. She smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "It already has a name," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of all she had learned. "It's a baseline, a place to start from." It was not an ending, but a beginning. It was not a claim staked on a piece of dirt, but a foundation laid for a life of purpose, strength, and quiet dignity. The land was not a possession, but a promise, And for the first time, Rose Whitcomb felt she was truly home. Thank you for staying with us for this story of quiet courage and hidden history. It reminds us that sometimes the most valuable inheritances aren't written in a will, but are waiting to be discovered through patience and hard work. If you were moved by Rose's journey, please leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of the forgotten corners of the past. We'll see you next time.